This is House Planning Help episode 92. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you want to self-build or renovate. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, my guest is Professor Tom Woolley from Rachel Bevan Architects as we talk about Hempcrete. What is it? Why might it be useful? Can it build us an ultra low energy building, or do we have to use it in specific places? We've got all sorts of questions. Just before we get started on that, this is a blog post that I've been meaning to put together for some time on finding land, and in my case, struggling to find land. And I was quite concerned. I thought I'd write a blog post because then not everyone has to read it, that it was very specific to the UK. So somewhat surprised when the first comment actually came from the US. And I thought I might read it to you because it's quite interesting as well. Hi to Claude over there, who says, "Hi Ben, I'm facing similar challenges here in Pennsylvania, USA, where the best land on which to build a house is already occupied. I've also found that vacant land owned by the city is fairly easily released, often at very low prices, to developers." Surprise, surprise. But not to individuals. So buying vacant land or properties with falling apart houses from private owners is more feasible. One way I and a group of people are trying to go about acquiring vacant land is to apply for purchase of contiguous properties as a group. But we still have to make a case for ourselves against developers who, from what I can see so far, are building rental units for profits. Good luck with your dream, says Claude. Thank you for that. And I'll link in this article, the blog post that we put together, into the show notes. I'll put that down at the bottom with some other resources that we mention. Let's get stuck into today's interview with Professor Tom Woolley. I attended a talk that he gave, and I'm not quite sure when this was. I remember it was at University College London, and it was all about materials, and he might just have released his book, Low Impact Building, so it's probably going back 18 months or so. And I thought to myself, right, we've got to interview him at some point. And I must admit, we have lots of people that we put onto our master plan, and it's just a matter of when we get there. Then Connor McGee emailed me after he'd stayed at a holiday let that Tom has and built with Hempcrete, and that was when Connor said, "You really ought to speak to Tom about this, because we stayed in this holiday let in Northern Ireland, and it was the winter, freezing cold, but inside this holiday let, it was lovely and warm, and it felt really good as well." So that was the trigger for me to make this happen. I started by asking Tom to tell me a little bit about his background.
Right, well, I've been an architect since the early 1970s, and much of the work I've done in my career has been with community groups. So we set up an architecture practice in London in the 70s, for instance, where we worked with community organisations. I did a lot of work with law centres, where we were investigating problems with dampness and poor conditions in housing, and also did a lot of work with the National Tower Blocks campaign, which helped to get a lot of the tower blocks demolished in the 80s. As a result of that, I got interested in environmental issues. In the 90s, we started producing something called the Green Building Digest, which was produced by the Association of Community Technical Aid Centres with funding from the Department of the Environment. And that then was published in book form in something called the Green Building Handbook. That was very popular with architects. There was a lot of people found it very useful, I think. But we were kind of learning on the job, if you know what I mean. This was trying to find out about things that nobody really had documented. For instance, I remember we did one of the issues on adhesives, and Sam Kimmins, who did a lot of the research, and I simply went round B&Q writing down what was on the back of all the tins of all the glues that were for sale. I mean, that was the only way we could actually get information about the products, for instance. The manufacturers wouldn't tell us. And then I then started to feel that the Green Building Handbook was much too negative, in the sense that it was largely a critique of conventional materials. We did do a few things about alternatives like straw bale building and so on. So I then did some research and produced a book called Natural Building, in which I documented all the projects I could find in England where people had used natural materials such as straw bales, earth building, timber frame, all sorts of different things. And I travelled around the country and went to see lots of people and everyone was incredibly welcoming and helpful, with a couple of exceptions. And that book's still selling well, even though it was done quite a few years ago now, just because there are surprisingly actually very few books in the UK about natural building, and that's become my passion ever since.
The term natural, I've been picked up on this before. Is it really easy to define? Because you could say natural materials, they're all brilliant, only build that way. And then you discover that actually you're not creating buildings that over time, they might not last as long, or there may be other issues. So it's never clear cut.
Well, I've always been a pragmatist. So, for instance, even though I have a lot of principles about sustainable building, I think you have to be realistic. So, for instance, if you're doing an innovative building, I wouldn't condemn anyone for using concrete in the foundations. Now, there are purists who would say, oh, you shouldn't do that, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do the other. I think you have to be pragmatic, but the objective is to try and reduce the embodied energy of the building as much as possible. And nowadays, it's perfectly easy to do that using natural materials. Also, these materials can actually be much more robust and longer lasting than conventional materials. I mean, for instance, there's a straw bale house just southwest of Paris that's been there for 90 years, and they've created a museum, visitor centre there now, and there's going to be a big opening event this summer. Natural buildings can be extremely robust. I mean, the buildings we're doing with Hempcrete, we're quite convinced that those will last for a very, very long time. Whereas many of the buildings that are being built with modern technology now, I'm quite concerned that we may be demolishing a lot of these buildings in 10 or 15 years, much the same as had to be done in the 70s and 80s with concrete buildings, because the technology is not fit for purpose and leads to all sorts of problems.
Just before we move on to Hempcrete, which you did mention there momentarily, and that's going to be the focus of our topic today, I understand the idea of trying to get the embodied energy of a building right down. But what if it is at the cost of the amount of energy that that building ends up using over time? Then is it not a false economy?
Well, the important thing to understand about embodied energy is that we use quite a substantial amount of energy to create new buildings or to renovate existing ones. There's a major study done by a chap called Jukka Heinonen, and a number of his colleagues have done several studies now in which they have counted the embodied energy that's gone into the development and the renewal of a large suburb of Helsinki. And they have come up with the concept of the carbon spike. And they suggest that the amount of embodied energy which is used using fairly conventional materials and construction methods is never recovered by the energy savings over time. The issue from my point of view is that we need to reduce CO2 emissions now. Now, you can argue that in 100 years, Heinonen and co. have produced a graph showing that eventually the two lines join in about 100 years' time. But that is absolutely no use at all. We need to reduce the amount of energy we use now. So, for instance, the production of petrochemical-based insulations in the UK uses about as much energy as a whole coal-fired power station to produce. So there's a huge amount of energy and CO2 emitted by the production of materials which are meant to save energy in buildings. So if you use low embodied energy materials, then you're substantially reducing the impact on the planet now, not in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. And I think this is an issue which is still not understood fully. There has been some very good work done, particularly by Sturgis and Associates, who do a lot of work on carbon counting. And they have managed to persuade developers that actually reusing existing buildings rather than knocking them down and putting up new ones makes a substantial difference to the CO2 emissions. But they still tend to go on and use quite high embodied energy materials in the building, so it's only kind of half the battle. So I think the embodied energy thing is something which is still not fully understood, and it's never been really recognised by government policymakers and so on. So natural low-impact materials are much more effective in terms of reducing energy. Also, we feel we can create buildings now using natural materials that are just as energy efficient as conventional construction.
Hempcrete, then. Let's start. What is it?
Well, this was a form of construction that was pioneered in France in 80s, 90s. I'm not sure exactly when it was first done. It was tried out as a way of renovating historic buildings where there were old timber frames, and they were looking for something that could be used to replace the old wattle and daub that was falling out of these buildings. And somebody hit on the idea of mixing hemp and lime together, and they discovered that it worked amazingly well, created a much better energy efficiency in the buildings, and also it doesn't seem to shrink, so you don't get crack lines around the timber frame. So then people began to realise that this was a material you could maybe use for new build construction. So essentially what you do is you take the woody core of the hemp plant, the straw effectively, which is chopped up into small pieces, 1 inch long. You mix that with a lime binder, and essentially we use hydraulic lime as the basis for it, but there are other ways of making the lime binder. And those are mixed together in a proportion of about 2 parts of lime by weight to 1 part of hemp. And that is then cast with water as a kind of lightweight concrete. It's put into shuttering, or it can be sprayed or plastered. There's all sorts of different things you can do with the material. And that creates a solid wall form of construction, which you normally use with timber frame or some other structural frame. And that provides you with all you need to create an airtight, energy-efficient building. But it's also breathable, healthy, it has lots of other advantages, which we could go into in a bit more detail. The main advantage, I suppose, of Hempcrete is it's very simple. So if you're now building a conventional timber frame, low-energy building, you would have the timber frame, you would have a sheathing board made out of OSB, you'd use some lightweight insulation material, you'd have 1 or more plastic membranes, you'd then have to put an external coating brickwork or timber cladding or something, and then you'd have a plasterboard interior lining. With Hempcrete, you've got your timber frame and your Hempcrete, and that's it. You don't need any of the other stuff. So it's incredibly simple. And even though people say, oh, well, it must be very slow and labour intensive, it's so simple that it's just as quick as building conventional construction.
It's interesting that its name is Hempcrete, but from what I took just then, lime is a key part of this.
Yeah, unfortunately, the crete bit is can be a little bit misleading. It's people have tried different names, hemp and lime construction and lime hemp, and in a sense it doesn't really matter. Once you get an idea of what it actually involves, then the name really doesn't matter too much. But it is a lightweight concrete at the end of the day. It's a composite form of construction, and it's like concrete in the sense that you've got a solid wall. Not load-bearing, though. The material is actually surprisingly strong, so it will do some of the things that load-bearing materials do. So, for instance, it can provide racking resistance to the wall. That means that the wall doesn't move sideways. And it's also very wind-resistant as well. So it is actually very strong.
When you were saying earlier about Hempcrete being used with a timber frame and the two together, that's all you need, I didn't quite understand. So you've got the timber frame there. What is it, almost in bricks that you're putting it down? How is it coming up in between the timber frame, just those two things?
Now, what you do is you have timber frame, which could be post and beam, or it could be a conventional sort of stick frame. You then screw plywood shuttering to the frame, which you space out from the timber frame. The timber frame can be in the middle of the wall, it can be on the outside or the inside. So you put long screws through shuttering fixed to the timber frame, say 300 millimetres thick, with a timber frame in the middle might be 150 mil. So you've got enough cover on outside of the timber frame to protect the timber. You then mix up your Hempcrete in a big mixer, and you get it in buckets or barrows, and you just shovel it into the shuttering. And it's very lightly tamped down with a stick. It doesn't need very much, just to make sure that it completely fills the shuttering. And then the material is so strong, it binds together so well, you can actually take the shuttering off immediately. Normally we leave it on overnight. That's more to protect the material from being kicked or picked at by somebody. But you can take the shuttering off straight away. Then you lift up the shuttering, and then you cast your next lift of Hempcrete. So it's like casting concrete. You can make Hempcrete blocks, but Hempcrete blocks don't give you such a strong wall because you've got to glue them together with mortar. There are circumstances where blocks might be more appropriate, but it's not really the best way to use hempcrete. The other great advantage of the material is you can create this continuity of the material. So the hempcrete runs all the way around the building and provides you with your airtightness layer.
How airtight have these buildings been? Do you have any examples of very, very airtight buildings?
Yes, well, you would plaster it on the inside with a lime plaster, though that's not actually essential. Some people actually like the slightly rough finish of the hempcrete internally, but if you plaster it, people have got down to passive house standard, and that's without using any plastic membranes at all. Most of the buildings we do get down to an airtightness of about 3. It's 3 because we can't afford, and our clients can't afford to buy really expensive triple glazed windows. So that's where the leakage occurs, not through the hempcrete wall. It's also quite important to get the detailing right around the windows and at the top of the walls where it joins the roof and so on. So, there are a few little tricks of the trade to make sure, but it really does give you extremely good airtightness, as generally you should get using any sort of wet materials, really.
What about it in terms of insulation?
Right, one of the huge problems we have in terms of promoting hemp and lime or hempcrete is that the performance of the material in a building is generally much better than would be predicted by the theoretical thermal resistance or U value of the material. With most of the people involved in hempcrete have always been very conservative about not overclaiming the performance. These people who make petrochemical foam insulations make ridiculous claims about how incredibly high performance their materials are. We've never done that with hempcrete. But what we've found over time is that the actual energy performance hugely exceeds the theoretical U value. So we would claim that a 300 mil wall would be roughly about 0.19 or 0.2 in terms of U value. But we know from experience of how buildings perform that in practice it does much better than that. A lot of studies recently have shown that conventional construction have what's called the performance gap, and that very often the performance can be as little as 30% and certainly 50% of what's predicted. We've got the opposite of that with hempcrete. I haven't actually come up with a good term that's the opposite of performance gap, but that's what we have with hempcrete. So, we have a cottage in our garden, which so it's just a few yards away from our house, which we let as a holiday cottage, and that was built about 5 years ago. And so we have a lot of data about the amount of energy that's used. When people say, how much gas do you use? Because there is actually gas underfloor heating. We say, well, we don't really know because we don't use any because the building doesn't need it. In the winter, we would warm it up for an hour so that it takes the chill off the cold air when people are coming into the building. But essentially, it needs very little heating. And so we know that just from practice. And the best way to assess the performance of buildings is by measuring how it performs over, 1 or 2 years when people are in occupation. And hempcrete does extremely well. Now, the reason it does that is because of its thermal mass properties. So it retains the warmth within the fabric of the building. Now, lightweight insulations can't do that. So if you do a monitoring of a building and you compare hempcrete with a building with lightweight insulation, the building with lightweight insulation, the internal temperature will fluctuate and follow the external temperature. With a hempcrete building, it stays the same, stays roughly, if there's no heating, stays at about 14 to 15 degrees. And because of that, the food and wine storage industry have latched onto this as a material because they are using hempcrete to insulate large food and wine storage warehouses because the building will stay at a temperature of about 14 degrees, which I understand is the correct temperature to store good wine at. And that's without any heating or cooling. Now, normally in the past they would have used lightweight insulation materials, but they would have to use heating or cooling to keep the building at the right temperature. With hempcrete, you don't need to do that. And this is a remarkable feature of the material, which I don't know any other insulation material that does that. People talk about thermal mass of concrete and they talk about thermal mass of earth buildings, but they don't maintain a steady temperature of 14 degrees in the way that hempcrete does.
Is hempcrete something that we just buy, or is it almost a formula that you put together yourself?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest disadvantages in terms of its adoption by mainstream construction, in that it's a site-mixed material. And that is actually the cheapest and most efficient way to use it. So actually it's fantastic for self-builders because it's relatively easy to do as long as you follow the correct instructions and the correct mix. So anybody can do it. I mean, I can teach somebody how to do hempcrete in half a day. It's very, very simple. Mainstream contractors, of course, they want everything to be ready, delivered to site these days. And as a result, a couple of companies have set up to make prefabricated panels with hempcrete. Now, personally, I actually don't think that's the way to go. But in certain circumstances, you can understand why that would suit mainstream construction. Unfortunately, by doing that, they lose some of the advantages of hempcrete, which is the continuity of the airtightness layer. So they end up putting breather membranes onto and sticky tape in much the same way as they do in other forms of construction. So I think that's not the best way to go. But we have recently done some experiments in developing a different way of doing prefabricated construction where we can maintain the continuity of the hempcrete. Unfortunately, I haven't got any money to do any further development of that because we would need to do structural testing and so on. But if we ever get a project where there's an opportunity to do that, then we think we've got a neat way of doing it. So that would solve the problem for mainstream contractors who want the material to arrive on site already dry and ready to be installed in the building.
Is there anything to watch out for in terms of using hempcrete? Could it go wrong?
Yes, it can go wrong. And unfortunately, quite a few people who've jumped on the bandwagon doing hempcrete who have got it wrong. And that has partly damaged the reputation in that people say it's very slow to dry out. But that's largely because they've been doing the wrong thing. So the main problems are there are quite a few projects where people have used a permanent shuttering board on the inside and then they've cast the hempcrete up against the permanent shuttering board. That stops the hempcrete drying out properly. I really no idea why they thought that was such a good idea to do. There are some advantages in using permanent shuttering board, and you can spray the hempcrete onto it. If you're going to do that, you have to use a breathable material such as wood wool or something like that. We have also done it with wood fibre board as an internal shuttering, but they have been using a very impermeable material, and that's not a good idea. The other thing that happens is that people think they can cut corners by using a cheaper lime binder. So they say, oh, well, you just need to use hydrated lime. At the moment, we use a blend of hydraulic hydrated lime with various pozzolanic additives. But these people just get cheap bagged hydrated lime from the builder's merchant and chuck it in with hempcrete, and then they're a bit puzzled because it doesn't dry out properly. And you end up with this sort of wet, soggy mess. Or they put so much lime in, they end up with something that's so solid it doesn't give you insulation. Also, when people are mixing on site, they tend to put far too much water in. So I went to do a workshop in Canada with some very good natural building people at the Endeavour Centre. They had not been very impressed with hempcrete. They said it didn't dry out properly and they didn't like it. And then when we actually did the stuff in the workshop, they said, but you're not putting enough water in. I said, yes, that's where you've been going wrong. You've been putting far too much water in. You have to make the water just enough to mix the two things together. And my partner, Rachel, says the best way to describe it is it should be like apple crumble topping. If you've got that sort of consistency with your hempcrete, then you've got it right. And people still go, oh, no, there can't be enough water in it, until you put it into the shuttering and then you tamp it down, and amazingly it all sticks together. So there are dangers that you can get it wrong if you're not careful. People do have to follow the correct instructions.
And you've talked a couple of times about drying, so do you need the right weather to do this?
Yes, I mean, we used to say that you shouldn't really cast hempcrete in the winter, but what that means is you shouldn't cast it when it's really cold. The project that was done by Kevin MacLeod in Swindon had a lot of problems with the hempcrete drying out, but that's because they cast it in that really, really bad cold winter a few years ago when there was a lot of snow and ice, and that the lime in the mix will not carbonate properly in those conditions. I did a project recently in North Wales at a place called Carmarthen in April, and I said I thought it was a bit early in the year and it might be a bit cold, and in the end we were putting a bit more lime into the mix, that the temperatures seemed to affect how well the mix was setting. But even so, it's still fine. The client's very happy with it, and it's has set, even though we were getting all sorts of horrible weather thrown at us. So it's a pretty resilient material, actually, and I'm often surprised how well it does. And the amazing thing about using lime is that over time it gains in strength. So over a few years it gets harder and firmer and more robust, really.
It's ancient material, though, isn't it, lime? Lime's been used for centuries.
Yes, I mean, the Romans discovered Hempcrete, effectively. They found that hydraulic lime, which is natural chalk with impurities which come from volcanic ash, and so buildings like the Pantheon and so on were built with that. There are people who suggested that they also used hemp, though I think that's fanciful. I'm not sure that's really true. And of course, hemp's been around for a long time. I mean, hemp was essentially the backbone of the British Empire because it was used to make sails and ropes. And at one time, farmers had to grow hemp in the UK. And there are lots of places around UK with the word Hempcrete in it. Hemel Hempstead and anywhere that's got the word hemp in it would have been a centre of hemp production in the past. Towns like Bridport on the south coast were essentially based on processing hemp that was mostly imported from Italy. But whether they actually used it and mixed it with lime to make hempcrete, there's no real evidence of that. But the lime itself is, as you say, it's traditional. We have found that we can add a little bit of cement to the mixture, and that actually acts as a sort of catalyst to help the hempcrete set quicker. But you don't have to do that. I mean, you can use a pozzolanic thing. What I would argue against is people doing too much experimenting on their own, unless they're really very sophisticated in their knowledge of lime. It's far better to buy a pre-formulated lime binder that's already ready-made for hempcrete, rather than trying to mix up your own mix on site. But I've been forced to do that when I've been going around the world. I mean, in South Africa, even in Canada, they didn't have any hydraulic lime. So we had to kind of simulate hydraulic lime using very pure hydrated lime and mixing some pozzolanic additives into it.
A quick question about foundations, because I can't remember, in a recent podcast I mentioned, could we have a hempcrete foundation? And I think it was Bjorn that we were speaking to said that it just wouldn't be a good thing to use. So have you experience of using it as a foundation, and what have you learnt?
No, up to now we've tended to use very conventional concrete footings. If you want to avoid concrete footings, then the thing is to build post and beam timber structure off the ground, and then you can cast the hempcrete down onto the timber frame. I have to say, as we go on and do more work on this, and I become more impressed with how hempcrete performs, I think if you increase the amount of binder in it and made a very much denser mix, you could possibly use it in the footings, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of point in doing that. You could also make limecrete footings, so you're mixing lime with aggregate and sand. It seems a waste in a sense to put material into the ground like that, unless of course you're trying to insulate around the perimeter of the building at ground level. But the main problem, I think, the worry would be that if it was permanently wet, that you could potentially get some rot within the hemp, so it's best to avoid that, I think.
We're just about out of time. I'll quickly squeeze in 2 more questions. One is whether we've missed anything. Is there another key area of hempcrete that we should be discussing, or at least mention in passing?
Well, the one thing that we haven't done a lot of in the UK, but they have in France, is to use hempcrete in floors and also in roofs. What you have to do is vary the mix in the roof, so you get a lightweight mixture. So you're using less lime, and that has to go onto a permanent shuttering ceiling board of some kind. We've also tried it out in floors, but there's always a bit of a worry about whether it's going to dry out well. But there is a builder in Ireland, Henry Thompson, who's done a number of Hempcrete floors, which are then tiled, and he seems very happy with them. So, it can be used in many other ways. The other important thing, which again needs further development, is using it as a renovation material. So you can plaster or cast hemp lime directly onto old stone or old brick walls, and on the inside or the outside. And it's a fantastic material because it can cope with dampness and moisture. It's breathable, so it allows the existing wall to breathe, and it's also hygroscopic, so it's absorbing moisture and humidity within the building, and that's an important aspect of natural materials which synthetic insulations don't have. So using it for renovation, to me, is the next big step. We know that many of the renovation techniques that have been used have not been that successful. The Retrofit for the Future programme, only about 4 of the projects out of 180 got anywhere near meeting the targets that were set by the Technology Strategy Board. And that's because synthetic insulation, doesn't matter how much you stick onto old walls, it never really quite does the job, whereas Hempcrete is amazingly successful. But there's not that much work being done so far on demonstrating how well it works. We've just started doing a small project in the climate chamber at Coventry University, where they're actually testing some hempcrete that's being plastered onto old brick walls for us to see what the thermal performance is. And the more data we get, the easier it'll be to convince people to use it that way.
And what is it like to be in one of these buildings? Does it feel any different?
Yes, that's one of the great things about our hemp cottage, that because we have lots of people staying in it because it's a holiday cottage. We had a couple recently stayed there, and the wife was severely asthmatic, and she said it was the first good night's sleep she'd had for a long time. People actually comment on the air quality in the building, even though they're not really aware of it as an issue. I mean, some people don't even take on board the fact that it doesn't look particularly different from conventional building, but they do comment on the air quality. They say how nice it is. In fact, we had one lady who wrote in the visitor's book that it was like waking up in a meadow. People do seem to experience a much better quality. It never feels clammy in there, because it maintains a steady humidity level around about 50%, which very few buildings do these days. And I think most people's experience of hempcrete is it's extremely nice to be in.
Tom, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
As ever, we've been taking notes at this end, and they're available online. And we try to make this educational at 3 levels. So if you haven't got much time, just scan the headlines, or you can go into more depth and read the key points. Or finally, if you want to go through it all again with a fine-tooth comb, you can read the transcript. Online today at houseplanninghelp.com/92. And we got pictures, we got links to Rachel Bevan Architects, to Tom's books as well. One more time, houseplanninghelp.com/92. My last piece of business today is to ask you to check out some videos that my production company Regen Media has just produced. It's the UK Passive House Awards, and I always enjoy being part of that if I can. So I've been travelling around the country doing some filming, getting the editing done, and I think you'll agree it's another year of outstanding projects. So I'm going to embed the winners into the bottom, not literally the winners, but the videos of the projects that won into the bottom of the show notes. And also there was a special feature this year, so I'll link across to that, and you can check out some of the winners from the very first year of the UK Passive House Awards. And what we decided to do, because we had this opportunity to go back and just see how have they been performing over time. It's coming up on 5 years since they were completed. Can we tell anything about their performance from all this monitoring that's been taking place? Next time, Tad Everhart, an energy advisor from Portland, is my guest. And I don't think we'll ever repeat this one. It's an interesting subject, but he built his own house and then a few years later retrofitted it. So it's an incredible story. He's a great guy as well. We'll do all of that next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.